On December 23rd, 2021, a former WoW player posted his frustration about Final Fantasy XIV's Endgame and was subsequently deleted from the internet. And while I'm only joking about them being deleted off the internet, what's happening here is the same thing that happens every time with every Final Fantasy XIV expansion, with every critique that is leveraged against it, both from the person leveraging the critique and the response they get from the Final Fantasy XIV community. Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name's Brian if you're new around here, and you might be asking yourself what qualifies me to talk about this subject so knowledgeably and with such passion. Well, I have been voted worst Final Fantasy XIV content creator and complainer by those who don't watch my videos. So, you know, you can take that for what it is, but we're going to dive into the subject because this is something you could literally set a clock to, typically 2 to 3 weeks, right around the time the first raids start making their way into the game. Right before Savage, you start to see a lot of frustration from players who've been trained, maybe correctly or incorrectly, I'll let you guys decide, but we'll jump into the original post completely here in a second. Whether this is essentially a good end game. And I think there's some really good responses that I've seen to this thread, and also just a couple things that I'd like to point out, especially as it relates to Death Monkey saying I should kind of make a guide talking about how to deal with Final Fantasy XIV critique. So hopefully this video is both educational and, you know, maybe a little bit entertainment based. We're going to dive into kind of the odds that we see here within the Final Fantasy XIV community and the struggles that the community has with critique, but also what are these critiques that are being leveraged at them? How can we understand them better? And to really understand this critique that is leveraged, I think there are two key aspects that we have to be honest about within the community. And number one is that Yoshi P has said multiple times that he wishes he has WoW's budget. He wished that he had WoW's budget. And what that means is that for what he's able to do with the budget that Square Enix has given him in the past, I think it really speaks to his team and their passion of what they want to create. But that's not to say that if he wasn't able to get more money, that we wouldn't get more of the things that maybe other games have gotten over the past. And even with like the latest surge, even with the Asmongold craze, which is one of the things that this post is going to point out, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden money and resources showed up years ago so that we'd be getting new and more content now. Asmongold asked this question, Yoshi P said, we're really happy for it, but the budget was already set years ago. This will impact the game going forward, but you got to think that there's got to be enough lead time for that to actually happen. And a lot of people within game development or within the gaming community typically think that a lot of things just like, oh, I can now do this. And usually I always like to think in like 12 to 18 month blocks of time from some event. So when Yoshi P says something pretty vague, you can typically see that about maybe 12 months to 18 months down the line coming into the game. And sometimes it takes even longer. And that's just the nature of game development. Now, the other thing that is important to know about Final Fantasy XIV is its community really can't handle critique. And I've seen this happen over and over again. People saying, I love this game, but it'd be great if it had one more boss fight. And then being, you know, inundated with death threats, having people actually mail them their home address and things like that. Serious things. Not like, oh, somebody was just mad and they just like, okay, haha. Like a lot of people sometimes like to excuse that side of the 14 community, but I know I've had that dance with them quite often. In fact, my wife was bullied out of this game. So at the core of it, I know that part of the community exists, and my hope is that community matures and grows up in terms of like understanding you don't have to defend Final Fantasy XIV. It's great, but a lot of people feel like, I guess the idea is that everybody has their favorite Pokemon, and if you don't have a favorite your favorite Pokemon's excluded from the game, it hurts. And so a lot of people have a deep relationship with Final Fantasy XIV, and they don't have the maturity, the mental or emotional maturity to allow somebody to have a different opinion of that. And hopefully we'll see more of that community, you know, mature in a way of saying like, all right, if you don't like it, that's fine. I'm having a good time. But social media tends to bring out the worst, as my voice cracks, in us. So let's go ahead and dive into the original post. Let's talk about their critique. Let's highlight a couple examples of, you know, counterpoints, both to the different issues, both to their points they're making, and also to the community's like struggle with, this kind of critique. So it starts off with, so we used to complain a lot about the time gating from Blizzard's part, which was true, specifically with the stupid renown system. But even though Shadowlands content delivery sucked on launch, there was a raid with Castle Nathria 10 bosses, Mythic Plus, and about 8 dungeons in PvP, which in 9.0 was pretty nice, but then they effed up and nerfed the PvP gear on PvE, and obviously the Covenants, Lamo. The problem with me with Shadowlands was that breaking it into Covenants, you only got to experience 25% of the content, and then they took way too much time for 9.1. That should have been at max in May, and then it dropped in August. Now people just don't care anymore about Shadowlands. They rush the story to the end Shadowlands in 9.2 instead of to get us into 10.0 ASAP, and Shadowlands is beyond salvageable. But now let's come to Endwalker. What do we got at launch? -2 dungeons? There are 8, but aside from that, 90 expert, there are no replayability of the 8 dungeons, and there are no Mythic Plus or anything similar. -1 raid wing and 4 bosses, 0 serious PvP, no progression system like Renown, or something similar that could obviously be the relic system. Now I'm realizing one thing, that we WoW refugees got to play Shadowbringers on the last patch when everything was released, and granted, leveling plus doing stuff, it seemed as that there was enough content. There is none. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but for me it feels like there was a concerted effort for many people to on WoW and on Blizzard. Granted that they helped themselves with the whole California lawsuit scandal and the game-wise, but the worst 9.1 is taking so long, and this is the real killer. Also, the level 60 trial helped. Kudos to Square Enix's marketing team. I believe that playing Final Fantasy XIV before the whole Asmongold craze, and he doesn't even play this game anymore, which actually is not true. I found the lack of updates on WoW crazy, and I went from the 1.1 to 90, experienced all the raids, some Eden Savages, and the new Pandemonium raids in just about 3 hours. I'm assuming that he's talking about Pandemonium in 3 hours as opposed to like all of that in 3 hours. The game is great as an RPG, the game's as great as a community game, Gold Saucer, Housing, etc., but as an endgame MMO, it really sucks. The worst thing about this part is it being time-gated worse than Blizzard. 4 bosses and that's it, 12 for the whole expansion. If we got to go by the same standard as last expansions, okay, Lamo. Now, one of the things I do want to point out real quick is Danny kind of points this out, and I think this is a really good counterpoint to what they're saying, and then I kind of want to go line by line and show a couple other comments here. He says it's criminal how badly Blizzard mind broke these people and made them think that only max level content matters in an MMO. That in and of itself, I think, is the purest form of critique that I really appreciate Danny's perspective on this one. And it's because of that. Like, I see this happen a lot. I came from Final Fantasy XI, where the end game started at level 1. And when I have that approach with MMOs, it's interesting when people take the opposite approach, and why I end up enjoying video games the way I enjoy video games versus somebody who enjoys video games completely different or is frustrated by those. I see those common critiques leveraged against Final Fantasy XIV time and time and time again, where for me, I go off of what Yoshi P has told us. Like, if you're not having fun, take a break, and more content will be waiting for you, ready for you, and the game continues to invite you back in. Typically what we see is the 6.1 in this case, and then the 6.5. Like, there's going to be a kind of a lull in gap, and that's where a lot of people will leverage all kinds of crazy critiques against 14 because they don't really understand it. They'll see various dips, and what 14 does really well is it kind of rides these waves. 6.5 will end up being a very big time for the game itself because you end up getting a lot of people who just play the game for story returning. And what ends up happening, especially with WoW's case, is that it kind of helps people kind of break their shackles, break that kind of addiction to one game, and realize that there's other options out there, and there's other things that people do and communities do that leverage, I think, a very positively, like just a very positive experience. And so, yes, I've been expecting this because it happens every time. There's been a WoW exodus, like every expansion around this time within Final Fantasy XIV. In fact, a lot of players kind of jump back and forth. The real key difference is what Blizzard's been up to, and will be interesting to see the lasting impact, because if they release a very good version of whatever is to happen with WoW next time, it'll be interesting to see if all of those things are forgiven or looked over. Not judging it, I'm just saying, like, that's traditionally what I see within gaming culture. Good game armor is a huge aspect. You can't have real conversations if the game is good, because people just want to use that as their escape, and I don't blame them, right? Like, at the end of the day, like, sometimes you just want to like play a video game and not have to worry about all the crap out there in the world. And so a lot of people approach these things from a lot of different ways. But let's dive into a couple more comments real quick. Now, Kryptoni says, and I think this is a really good kind of point, why is this being booed? He's right, LOL. Final Fantasy XIV is a great RPG, but it sucks as an MMORPG. And my question would be like, what do you define as an MMO? Like if MMO is a pure core aspect of the end game, is that if that's the be all end all, Final Fantasy XIV's MMO is best experienced in a 0.5 patch when you have so much more content to do. But that kind of precludes like kind of two things that I see. First and foremost, within the and even the Donkey Ori points it out, you could actually look at the average patch cycle and see what you're getting. Final Fantasy XIV has a consistent structure which can be predictable, but at the end of the day is valuable, and that value can't be understated. Like it is really critical to the success of the game, the patch cycle that delivers content consistently, keeps players engaged who want to be engaged, and it invites players back who want to step back and take a break, because there's a lot of different style of people who play Final Fantasy XIV. Now, why is this post being booed? Well, they're like, again, the defense force feels like they have to defend Final Fantasy XIV, so much so that they'll go out of their way to make like insane threats. So much that Yoshi P's commented on in the past, that at the end of the day, like I always kind of view video games almost as in terms of a relationship. Like imagine if your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your wife or your husband was being attacked and being criticized. Like it doesn't matter, even if that criticism is true, you still want to defend them. And one of the things Final Fantasy XIV gives us as players is that relationship with these characters and this world, more so than anything else. In fact, you actually see the same kind of thing applying in single player games, where somebody will come out and defend the game that they love. And social media only exacerbates this, because you don't end up having that real connection. You don't end up being able to kind of have that point counterpoint conversation. It can only be done typically in maybe 140, 200 characters, or over on Reddit, in which that you end up having more karma farms than anything else. So people end up becoming afraid about actually posting any kind of critique, because usually the response ends up being go play something else, which isn't a good thing. Like let's hold ourselves accountable and say, if you're not having fun, that's okay. Let's talk about like what you want to see. Maybe we can direct you to content within the game itself, but you can always take a break and you're always welcome back. I find they're always welcoming back a much better approach to the overall health of the community, rather than a lot of the venom that we see happening within the game and within, obviously social media. Now, in game, it's gotten a lot better. The enforcement of the rules in terms of service is actually, I think, overall improved communication, because anybody who wants to be very venomous usually ends up just kind of keeping it to themselves or ranting about it on a stream or something like that. Whereas over on like the forums and on social media, you don't really maybe get the full context of what the person is trying to say, versus the venom that they end up getting for saying it in the first place. So it ends up trying to adhere. And one of the things that I've always been concerned about is kind of this one mind set. Like you can't talk about 14 negatively, and that's where the good game community meme comes from within Final Fantasy 14. So I think there's some really good points that are made in the fact that like it's okay to criticize Final Fantasy 14. In fact, I encourage it. I think critique ends up leading to a better game overall, getting more perspectives. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with a critique, but there's no reason to have those kind of attacks. So how do you deal with this? How do we as a community deal with this? If you see something you don't agree with online, in a tweet, on a post, I think the common rule that I end up living by is that you're not going to change somebody's mind with a quicker rewarded or aggressive retort. I think usually for me, I always try to go another route of trying to understand where they're coming from and why they're coming from it. So if we actually look back to the core aspect of the original critique from the original poster, where they said what they said, I think a lot of it is stemming from them being trained by WoW to expect these things. And Final Fantasy XIV, Yoshi P said that he'd love to have that kind of budget. I think one of the things that ends up getting us into that kind of world, and you got to be there carefully, because I don't think a lot of people really like what WoW is doing, even in terms of like its content grind. Sure, you add more content, but a lot of the complaints were like you constantly felt like you were falling behind. And so there was this sense that I always called it kind of the sense of dread, that eventually you're going to get tired and you're going to miss a week, and then you're going to feel like you can't keep up. One of the things that keeps me from playing battle passes that expire. It's one of the things that, like, when I look at my normal life, like, it's so much more enjoyable to be able to play a game and enjoy it and not consider it a second job. And some of the things that people point out, like, people treat WoW like it's a second job, especially from a content creator perspective. And I think that there's a healthier balance to actually be found in 14. And that balance, though, comes with the fact that you are paying a subscription, and it's perfectly acceptable to pause that subscription and come back. In fact, that data point I think is more important to the overall health of the game than you realize, because when you break it down, I think Yoshi P would happily make more content for us. In fact, that's what he said he'd like to do. But I think when it comes down to it, is like, hey, imagine if we didn't lose all of these subscribers around 6.1. How would we keep those people engaged, or how can we continue to grow to their overall goal right now of 30 million players? I think essentially that comes down to like, oh, imagine if we had this kind of content. I think that if they do anything, what the nice thing is the Yoshi P has a roadmap of what not to do. And so if they do ever add like a Mythic Plus style system to Final Fantasy 14, the goal would be that it wouldn't be required to do the raid system. It would just be an additional progression that you as a player had the option of engaging with or not engaging with it. If they ever add more things that you have to do to try and keep up, eventually I think that just leads to an overall fatigue and an overall frustration with the game itself. So it comes down into that there is a trained mindset of people coming from other MMOs, WoW specifically. I don't think that's a healthy kind of mindset, and it is a way of like, maybe we can as a community kind of continue to invite them to be like, it's perfectly fine. Like there's a lot of other really good games. Like take a break, come back. I guarantee you there's gonna be more content, especially with the PvP updates and more. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments below. Thanks for being here. If you enjoyed the video, give a like, hit subscribe if you haven't subscribed to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. But until then, guys, take care.
I just want to say I'm really glad you're feeling better, and I love the videos. Well, I love you too. Michelle? Shoot for the moon, and so even if you fail, you'll reach the stars. Go for the 100K subscribers. Yeah.